In a little over 8 months' time, EU4 will be 10 years old, and is by some margin the oldest game that Paradox is currently developing. I think it's high time for an EU5 announcement, and in this video I'm going to list some of the things that I want to see in the sequel to my most played game of all time. For starters, the things I want to see in the sequel is a good, functional game on release. In Paradox's last 3 games, Victoria 3, Crusader Kings 3, and Imperator Rome, launches have been less than stellar, to put it mildly. Imperator's release was an abomination, and while the game did get 2 years worth of patches, updates, and content, and in my own opinion became a very interesting and rich game with some excellent mechanics, it was not enough to revive what was basically dead on arrival, and the game was shelved. CK3's release was by far the best of the 3. But since its release, it's been gathering more and more unrest due to a lack of flavour in the game, and features that were in and well liked in CK2 that were not ported to the new game. Things like merchant republics, unique government for the Roman Empire, secret societies, etc. were not in on release and remain to this day as features that are heavily requested but still absent. And finally, Victoria 3. Paradox's most recent release has been absolutely appalling, with some of the worst performance issues I have ever experienced in a Paradox game, a woeful lack of flavour, and dysfunctional mechanics that make me scratch my head in disbelief whenever I encounter people who say they like or love the game. So, EU5. Can it even buck the trend? Is it even possible for the game to have all of the flavour and mechanics that EU4 took 9 years of development to acquire? We will have to wait and see. But enough about that. What particular mechanics am I most interested to see in a potential EU5? Firstly, I want to talk about the map. I maintain that Imperator Rome's map is the prettiest map that Paradox has yet to release. CK3 doesn't come remotely close, especially when you look at Mesopotamia or Egypt, and Victoria 3's through their, what's the opposite of virtue? Through the plague that is their warfare system, through the shocking disaster that is their warfare system, through the abhorrent mess that is their warfare system, something like that. Because of their warfare system, it doesn't have the same requirements of a strictly defined province system seen in more standard Paradox games. Now, what I would like to see from the map is more of a Victoria 3 style. Yes, I know, absolutely crazy considering what I've just said, but hear me out. I think the relief, that is, the mountains and valleys and the overall shape of the terrain, I think the relief of the Victoria 3 map is some of the best to date, and while it would not work overly well with the standard Paradox model of warfare, it would work reasonably well with the warfare I have in mind. To get this out of the way right off the bat, if EU5 has the same kind of warfare as Victoria 3, I'm out. I'm gone. Video ended, EU5 in the bin. While I'm not completely married to the idea of armies in EU5 working identically to how they do in EU4, I do think very strongly that the military aspect of the game needs to follow a few key pillars. The first and most important of which is player agency, something that was completely absent in Victoria 3. I would like to see a return of the stack-based system, but I also think it could come with some improvements. Perhaps instead of individual units that you build to merge into your stack, some kind of army builder could be utilized, similar to the way one builds divisions in Hearts of Iron 4. What this would allow for is a more customizable and less paint-by-numbers way of building armies than what we see in EU4. As for combat itself, if we stick with the same system of combat width, a front and a back rank, and dice rolls, I would not be overly unhappy. Though I do think some innovation could be had here, it has to be done well, so as to not make the player frustrated at perceived unfairness, but also not be entirely deterministic. A more out there kind of idea I have for EU5's warfare is also to separate the stacks from provinces entirely, and have armies be able to move much more granularly through terrain on the map. For this, I envisage something similar to the way armies move in a Knights of Honor or a Total War game, with each army having their own zone of control and combat happening when two armies' zones of control interact. I see this system working really well with a logistics system too. I would make it so that the path an army takes is tracked and supply would flow from your own controlled or allied territory to your army, with the enemy able to cut off supplies by moving armies into this path. As for forts, I would have them create their own zones of control, but instead of these zones preventing army movement, they would instead cut off supplies to the army and make them much weaker. So this system would require a big change to the province system. As with armies no longer attached to them for movement, the paths for armies to take would need to be determined in other ways. I think this would best be represented by a worldwide road network, though obviously not all of these roads would be visible at the start of the game, and would be created over time with the development of the land and colonization. I would also detach fort placement from the province system, though the upkeep would of course remain, and make forts more of a map-based feature, as their placement location would be much more important with this setup. While on the topic of warfare, I want to talk about peace deals. While I'm very much against the idea of implementing the diplomatic play system from Victoria 3, I do think that bilateral peace deals should be a thing in EU5. It should be possible for a peace deal to include, you give me X, Y, and Z provinces, and in return I will give you some ducats. Now, moving on from warfare, which I'm sure is a rather controversial topic, let's talk about something with no controversy attached whatsoever. Characters. Paradox created their 3D character tool with the development of the Gemini layer of their engine, Clausewitz, and it's been a feature of Imperator, CK3, and Victoria 3. I think it is a fool's hope to assume that EU5 will not feature it in some way, so instead of ignoring it, I'll tackle it head on. Your monarch or ruler will have a 3D portrait that will show them growing up and growing old. It's also a prime place for the game to sell cosmetic DLC to keep the game alive post-release, and while I'm sure this will receive some backlash, I will remind you that DLC is inevitable, and I'd much rather have it be cosmetic stuff over mechanics. I'd also like to see, with this system, some form of family tree. I don't need it to be as in-depth or detailed as the one seen in Crusader Kings 3, where your game will lag after the 3rd generation. Just something to show the immediate family of the monarch, and perhaps any links they have to foreign kingdoms to make things like personal unions a bit less of a mysterious dice roll than they currently are. I think it's also safe to say that both generals and advisors will be getting these portraits, so we will likely see their roles expanded somewhat, as having a 3D model for a character who simply gives plus 10% trade efficiency is a tad boring. These characters, especially the generals, will likely have more modifiers attached to them. Things like aggressive and mountain fighter, naval invader, etc. would be my guess. As I just talked about advisors, I'll move on to talk about something else that is also not remotely controversial in the slightest. Monarch Points, or mana. I would like to see this system gone entirely. I don't like it. I never have. What I would like to see instead is a system closer to either Imperator's political influence or Victoria 3's capacities. I see each of these systems as a much more realistic way of depicting a state's power than the system of Monarch Points. Instead of provinces needing to be cored with admin points, the Victoria 3 system of states permanently taking up an amount of bureaucratic capacity would work really well. And as I personally cannot stand the way that development works in EU4, where you spend your magical mana points to instantly improve provinces, I would also not be at all unhappy to see that axed entirely. The only system that I see needing a full rework because of the loss of Monarch Points is the tech system, and I think I'd like to see something similar to Victoria 2's system implemented here. Have technology separated not by admin, diplo, and military, but more rationally. Hell, even just straight up stealing the categories from Victoria 2 of army, navy, commerce, culture, and industry would be an improvement. The main way you would increase your technology would be by doing the thing it's associated with. You want to improve your military tech? The fastest way would be to be at war, innovating new ways to kill each other through necessity. In our own history, one of the ways that Europeans pulled ahead of the rest of the world when it came to their naval technology was an arms race against other naval powers. The Dutch and the English, for example, raced each other to create better warships with better tactics to get the edge over one another in the 17th and 18th centuries. The system I propose would make it so that the more you engage in a certain act, the faster you will accrue technology in this area. I feel this would probably be enough to not require an institution system, but I would also not be opposed to one being included too. The technologies you gain should then be spread around via trade links, so a way to prevent your advances reaching the hands of your enemies would be to embargo them, with naval and military technologies also having some kind of spread based on rivals too. Speaking of embargoes and trade, I really don't like that in EU4 trade is basically theft. The system of trade nodes and end nodes is showing its age, and I envisage a system whereby trade is not so static. While this period is known for wealth coming to Europe from Asia and America, it wasn't the zero-sum game that EU4 makes it out to be. Whether this comes in the form of trade node flow being omnidirectional or entirely new trade system, I don't know. But I do hope the system is overhauled. Looking to other grand strategy games for inspiration for the perfect trade system isn't really working for me either, as none of the games have the feeling I'm after. Perhaps trade should be mostly automated, with your traders being an entirely autonomous group that will trade as they will, with perhaps the option for the player to make specific diplomacy with other nations to increase the trade flow between them. This may take a bit of player autonomy away, but in comparison to EU4, where traders are set and forget with the only interaction being where to place your trade ships, I think this is an adequate trade-off. Now, I've touched on provinces being different, and how I want to see the death of mana. So let me quickly touch on my idea for how to represent the wealth and prosperity of individual provinces in EU5. Development is gone, as far as you understand it in EU4. For EU5, I would love to see population make a return, and yes, it would be a return as EU3 did have pops. I don't want something as detailed as a Victoria game, nor as malleable as Imperator, but something you could nudge to grow or decline based on your actions in-game, represented simply as a number. You click on Constantinople, you get your UI telling you how many people is in the province, say 200,000 or whatever the actual number is. Development as something that you can improve via clicking a button would be gone, and instead the development would be a calculation based on the infrastructure or buildings that you have in the province and the population. This is somewhat similar to the way that the mod Mayo and Taxes does things, but of course with the benefit of being an integral part of the system and not a hacky workaround, it could be implemented much smoother and with far less performance overhead than Mayo and Taxes can do. Another change I'd like to see to provinces is having multiple goods per province. In EU4, each province has a single trade good. If a province has grain, chances are pretty high that it will have grain from the very start to the very end of the game. I would love to see that changed, and have it be so that each province can have multiple goods. I wouldn't go so far as to flatly implement the Victoria 3 system, but perhaps some middle ground could be found. In my imagined system, provinces could have a maximum of 3 goods: an agricultural good, a resource good, and a manufactured good. Not all provinces would have all 3. For example, a completely depopulated desert might not have any at all. And if a province does not have a manufactured good, then through the increased development of that province, through population and construction, not clicking a button, then that province could acquire a manufactured good. Now, a question I keep going back and forth on is whether I think EU5 should have some production chain. In our own history, there was a trade link between the English and the Netherlands, where the English wool was traded to the Dutch in order to be turned into cloth, and then the cloth sold back to England. Would I make these manufactured goods require some resource input? On the one hand, it's more realistic and adds more logistical depth to the trading system. On the other hand, EU5 should not be Victoria 4, and a little more abstraction is probably not a bad thing in this case. Finally, I want to touch on colonization. I quite like the idea that Victoria 3 had with its colonization, where you start off with only a tiny trading outpost that slowly grows and spreads out over the entire province, and I would like to see that in EU5. I think it makes more sense than your colonist arrives and suddenly, without any settlers at all, you de facto own the entire province. I do think Victoria 3's colonization does not cost nearly enough, so I would keep EU4's costs for colonization, but with the addition of the population system I wish to see in EU5, I think colonization can be modelled much more realistically, and much more satisfyingly. In our own history, the colonization of the Americas led to a colossal reduction in the native population, and really the smallpox events in EU4 just don't cut it at all. But having a population system and seeing the effects that European contact had on the Americas would make it all the more real and more historically accurate. So, those are my thoughts for the major mechanic design choices in EU5. I would love to hear your thoughts though, so please do leave them in the comments. Oh, balls, I actually forgot. EU4 has the best UI of any Paradox title to date. Its notification system is far superior to that little notification bubble thing that Crusader Kings 3 and Victoria 3 have. Also, map modes are actually amazing, and being able to select map modes is far superior to this zooming in crap that the other two Formation games have. While we're at it, WASD are for map modes, not moving the map around. Middle mouse click and drag will always be objectively better for that, though I'm totally in favour of rebindable hotkeys so we can all choose whatever the hell we want. And finally, Johan should be the lead developer for EU5. That's it, I'm done, bye. If you liked the video, please help me out and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Maybe leave a comment down below too, it really does help out the channel. If you have the means and are willing to, there's a link to my Patreon in the description below. It's the best way to support me and the effort that goes into creating the content you've just watched, and hopefully will continue to watch, and allows me to focus more on making videos without the stress and worry of another meteor striking my channel, be it hacks, demonetization, or the third adpocalypse. You can also support me by heading over to Twitch and following there, or joining my Discord and being an active member of the community. All those links are in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.